hand you over to Ms. Yvonne Agard, our chair for the National Committee, Management Technical Committee, to provide you some information on the background of standards and importance. Ms. Yvonne Agard.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for your participation and your interest in the work of the Bureau of Standards as we continue to build a quality infrastructure for St. Lucia. As you may be aware, in addition to the core work of the Bureau of Standards as an institution, there are quite a few persons who form the technical committees, and we do that on a voluntary basis. And we assist the Bureau in the development of those standards. And of course, most of us who are on those technical committees come with a level of expertise in the various areas. So in our technical committee grouping, you know, we have persons with their core competencies in quality management systems at an international level and standards. And so our work, what we do, assist the Bureau of Standards overall. So here we look at the background of standards and its importance. And I think all of us in our daily lives want to feel, you know, assured that whatever product or service that we use, it's against a particular international standard. And so the Bureau of Standards have embarked on the adoption of several international standards that would assist us as a small island developing state to augment our game, specifically in the international market. And you would understand for international trade and even for the domestic markets, we need standards. We need to adopt standards. We need to be able to work with and become compliant to those standards. And so the Bureau of Standards, through some support from the Caribbean Standard Network, has provided support and funding to help us in St. Lucia to be able to enhance and strengthen our economic performance through standards development. Again, I think we all know how important standard is. And so I understand in some cases we may think that it may be difficult to adopt, but with the work of the Bureau of Standards and its technical committee, we are here to ensure that we know you go through the process of standard adoption. So this consultation today is just part of our effort in bringing to you and to working with you and to hearing from you your feedback and what you feel about a particular standard. Your feedback is important to help us in our thrust to develop that kind of quality infrastructure mindset that is needed for us in this country, especially now when we, you know, with the advent of COVID, we recognize that we're no longer insulated and we're just 238 square miles, but we are part of a global international network, and we need to be able to work and operate in that way. With that said, thank you, and I trust that you would remain with us for the rest of the presentation, get your feedback and hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yvonne, for that background information. And now we'll go over to Mr. John Lord to provide us the information on DNS ISO 18788-2015 Management System for Private Security Operations, Requirements with Guidance for Use. Mr. John Lord. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, John Lord, and my background, apart from aeronautical engineering, is security. I've been doing training for security for the last 10 years and also doing operations auditing from a security point of view and also site auditing. The elements of the standard covers introduction, scope, normative references, terms and definitions, context of organization, leadership, planning, support, and operation. We will focus mainly on the introduction and the planning and the support and the operations. And we're looking at the scope. This international standard provides a framework for establishing, implementing, operating, monitoring, reviewing, maintaining, and improving the management of security operations. It provides the principles and requirements for security operations management systems, SOMS. Conduct of professional security operations to meet the requirements of clients and other stakeholders, accountability to law and respect for human rights, consistency with voluntary commitments to which it subscribes. The international standard also provides a means for organizations and those who utilize security services to demonstrate commitment to the relevant legal obligations, as well as to the good practices provided in the Montreal document on pertinent international service providers. Wait, hold on a second. Legal obligations and good practices for states related to operations of private military and security companies during armed conflict. They are now referring to the Montreal document, and conformance with principles and commitments outlined in the International Code of Conduct for private security service providers. That is a document that the client and service providers need to acquaint themselves with. Now, this international standard is specifically aimed at any organization operating in circumstances where governance may be weak and the rule of law undermined due to human or natural cause and events. Human mainly comes in the form of threats, natural caused events come in the form of hazards. Applicable laws can include all kinds of laws, including but not limited to national, regional, international, or customary laws. It is the sole responsibility of the user of this international standard to determine the applicable laws and to abide by them. The international standards I just noticed a thing here from. The international standard does not provide any advice or guidance concerning applicable laws. The conflict between laws or the interpretation of the laws, codes, treaties, or documents mentioned within it. This international standard is applicable to any organization that needs to establish, implement, maintain, and improve on SOMS, which is Security Operations Management Systems. SOMS assess its conformity with its stated security operations management policy. It demonstrates its ability to consistently provide services that meet client needs and are in conformance with applicable international, national, and local laws and human rights requirements. The human rights requirements are definitely very important because they come as threats when not abided with. This international standard is applicable to any organization that needs to establish, implement, maintain, and improve and SOMS. Assess its conformity with its stated security operations management policy, and demonstrates its ability to consistently provide services that meet client needs and are in conformance with applicable international, national, and local laws and human rights requirements. The generic principles and requirements of this international standard are intended to be incorporated in any organization's integrated management system based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. It is not intended to promote a uniform approach to all organizations in all sectors. The design and implementation of security operations plans, procedures, and practices are expected to take into resources, operations, processes, products, and services.
To introduce Mr. Jerry George to present on DNS ISO 28000-2007, Specification for Security Management Systems for the Supply Chain. Mr. Jerry George.
Good morning, everyone. We're looking at the 28,000 DNS ISO 28,000-2007. Essentially, this is a standard developed in response to demand from the industry for a security management standard. And the objective is to have a high-level standard that would allow an organization to establish overall supply chain security management system. Now, supply chain refers to both upstream and downstream. So in the context of St. Lucia, where we are primarily at the consumer end, upstream would be the suppliers who provide the product, and the downstream would typically be the consumers. For manufacturers, for example, if we look at WLBL, distillers, and so on, their upstream would be the ones providing them like raw materials, and the downstream would be persons who purchase a product and pass it on. It looks at where the organization would assess the security environment within which it operates to determine whether there are adequate security measures in place, and if any other regulatory requirements already exist with which there is already compliance by the organization. If there are any needs identified, then the organization would implement mechanisms and processes to meet those needs. And as supply chains are dynamic, it's not a static implementation. It's a continuous process that you keep reviewing over time. And if we go on to the next slide. Next one. Yes. So this diagram indicates the other standards that are referenced and relevant to the ISO 2800 standard. Let's keep going. So the scope of this, as I said, it specifies the requirements for a security management system, and a business can look at applying the standard to primarily for the supply chain, but it can look at either its entire operations or particular business unit or subunits within the organization. The implementation of that standard depends on the scope. We can go to the next slide, please. Right. Okay. The organization determines, sorry, go back. Is it back? Let's go. No, go down. Okay, I'll try to step through. Sorry. Okay, so it specifies the requirements for the security management system and those that are critical to the supply chain, as I touched on already. It can be linked, or it is linked to many aspects of the business management. It can be the entire business process, or it can be a specific business units. The aspects look at the activities either controlled or influenced by the organizations that impact the supply chain security. So those would also refer to both internal and external parties that have an impact on that security. The other aspects, sorry, the other aspects would be considered directly and what the nature of that aspect is. So for example, transportation, a company who outsources the transportation would have to look at that as part of their supply chain security along the supply chain. Next slide, please. Now, it's applicable to all sizes of organizations, regardless of size, and in different areas: manufacturing, service, storage, transportation, and at various stages or at any stage of the supply chain, particularly if they want to establish, implement, maintain, or improve security management system to ensure there is conformance to stated security management policy and to be able to demonstrate such conformance to others. There would be key requirements, especially when you look at some areas such as food, medication, things that could impact human health, human life, and so on. So for some businesses, it's almost imperative that they have to be able to demonstrate such conformance. It's also necessary where they wish to seek certification and registration of the security management system by an accredited third party or certification body. Or they can choose to make a self-determination and self-declaration of conformance to those international standards. There are legislative and regulatory codes that address some of the requirements. However, it's not the intention of the international standard to require duplicative demonstration of conformance. So if there are already existing requirements, then the standard does not try to duplicate those requirements. Organizations who choose third-party certification can further demonstrate that they are contributing significantly to supply chain security. Before we go on to the next one, as persons look through the standards, they will, and everyone's encouraged to read through it extensively, and yes, they are quite long, but for 2800, section 3 is primarily terms definition, and section 4 is where it really gets into the implementation of the standard and the different parts, requirements, what needs to be done, how it has to be done. In fact, the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act aspect of it, and defines what the specific requirements are for an organization. So we should be able to get a clear guidance as to what would need to be done in the various subsections of the standards, particularly in section 4, sorry, the various subsections there. Next one. Okay, 28,004-1, and this one is actually a much larger document. It looks like at the guidelines for the implementation of ISO 28000, Part 1, the general principles. So this one really gets into the meat of the matter, and where, just switch my screen here. Yeah, it looks into the implementation of the 2800 standard. The standards document has the various sections: introduction, scope, the normative references, terms and definitions, security management system elements, requirements, the policy, and the risk assessment and planning. It also looks at the implementation and operation, check-in and corrective action, management review, continual improvement, and the various annexes. So this standard looks at this, it's a specification for the supply management system, security management system, sorry, for the supply chain. And the specification of those requirements. The scope is to establish, inspect, maintain, and improve that system. So the standard specifies the requirements for implementing that system, but it's not limited to financing, manufacturing, information management, or the facilities for packing, storing, and transferring the goods between modes of transport and location. Next slide, please. Security management is linked to many other aspects of business management, which we kind of touched on just in the prior standard, where the aspects touch directly or impact directly on security management, then it needs to be considered. It needs to be considered as part of this process. This standard is applicable to all sizes of organizations, again, regardless of size, multinational to small manufacturing, and to different areas: manufacturing, storage, transportation, at any stage of the production or supply chain, as long as they wish to establish, implement, maintain, and improve a security management system. It aims to assure compliance with stated security management policy and demonstration of such compliance to others as before. And an organization would implement those standards if they want to seek certification or registration of a security management system, or they can or if they wish to make a self-determination or self-declaration of that compliance with the standard. There are legislative and regulatory codes that address some of the requirements in this standard. And also, again, it is not the intention to duplicate the existing standards. Next slide. Yeah, I've covered that one. Now, just briefly, with regards to that standard, 28004, it looks at primarily the implementation of the standard. And when going through it, you have the different sections and subsections that essentially go through the process. What is required? So you have the sections looking at requirements, the intent, your typical inputs, your process, and outputs for the different aspects of the standard. So reading through it would give sufficient detail as to what is required. You have 4.2, the requirements of top management, 4.3, risk assessment and planning, 4.4, implementation and operation, 4.5, check-in and corrective action, and so on. And you have the various appendices that I think covers the basics of those two standards. So this standard 28001 of 2007, and once again, persons would have access to the actual standards documents to read through. And it is broken up as with all of the others in the standard format: introduction, scope, the references, terms and definitions, the field of application, and the security chain, supply chain security processes. I keep making that mistake of swapping supply and security, probably because of my industry where we primarily focus on security. So I tend to put security first. And you have the annexes on the next slide, Annex A, B, and C, which gives more information on Annex A on the supply chain security process. B, it looks at the methodology for security risk assessment and development of countermeasures. And I'm guessing that one would be quite important for those who actually have to get into the action and the procedures for the security risk systems. And Annex C provides guidance for obtaining advice and certification general. Okay, so this standard provides the requirements and guidance for organizations in international supply chains. And let me just ask quickly, would that, the fact that it specifies international supply chains, would that mean it would not necessarily apply for local, or it would be optional if a local company chooses to maintain that standard even though their product is primarily for a local market? And I could probably leave that question to the end of the discussion period. Okay, it looks at developing and implementing a supply chain security process, establish and document a minimum level of security within a supply chain or a segment of the supply chain. And in the previous standards, they mentioned how the standards can apply to either the entire operations or a segment of that operation, part of the business unit. It assists in meeting the applicable authorized economic operator, the AEO criteria, which is set forth in the World Customs Organization framework or standards, and conforming national supply chain security programs. And it also establishes certain documentation requirements that would allow for verification to be done. The users of this standard would define what portion of the international supply chain they fall within which they have established security. They will conduct security assessments on that portion of the supply chain and develop adequate countermeasures, develop and implement a supply chain security plan, and train security personnel in their security-related duties. So this standard primarily goes also to implementation on a specific aspect, a specific part of the supply chain, and establishing security on those aspects of that supply chain. Then we look at next slide. The next standard is 28002 of 2011, Security Management Systems for the Supply Chain, Development of Resilience in the Supply Chain, Requirements with Guidance of Use. And resilience, well, we know we're in a multi-disaster zone where we have annually hurricanes and so on. So resilience of supply chain is something that's actually very dear to our mode of our existence, pretty much. So once again, you have the standard broken up into the various sections: introduction, normative references, terms and definitions, requirements of a management system containing resilience policy. So you need to have that resilience policy within your management system. You have the annexes. Annex A is an informative guidance of the incorporation of the international standard into a management standard. Annex B, next slide. Informative guidance of the use of the international standard. Annex C is terminology conventions, and Annex D qualifiers, qualifiers to the application. Then there is an infographic that shows the relationships, the various relationships of the resilience management policy within the supplier chain, and how different organizations and the environments impact and are impacted by such a policy. The process approach, how would a firm go about implementing such a process? And it shows the various interactions. And yes, that is detailed within the policy document, the standards document. And once again, we look at the PDCA model and the different requirements at every stage of that at every stage of the planning, doing, checking, and acting. And it is not just an implementation, it is a continuous process that even after you act, you go back into planning and review once again. Next slide. The international standard specifies the requirements for a resilience management policy in the supply chain to enable the organization to develop and implement policies, objectives, and programs, taking into account the legal, regulatory, and other requirements to which the organization subscribes. It also requires information, next slide, please, about significant risks, hazards, and threats that may have consequence to the organization, the stakeholders, and supply chain. So you have to look at what are the typical risks, the hazards, the threats, and so on that would impact the supply chain. Used to be, we primarily had to just worry about hurricanes. Lately, we also have earthquakes, we have tsunami, and we have pandemics that are no longer just things we see in movies. Looks at the protection of its assets, processes, and management of disruptive incidents. So how would an organization respond to those disruptive incidents? And the standard replies to risks that the organization identifies as those it can control, influence, or reduce, as well as those it cannot anticipate. It does not itself state specific performance criteria. So even if there are risks that are completely out of our hands, those still need to be identified and considered, because it will have an impact on what happens and how one responds to it. The standard is applicable to any organization that wishes to establish, implement, maintain, and improve a resilience management policy for the organization and supply chain, or to assure itself of its conformity to stated resilience management policy. It demonstrates its management system contains a well-developed resilience management policy by making a self-determination or self-declaration or seeking confirmation of its conformance by parties having an interest in the organization, such as customers, or seeking confirmation of its self-declaration by a party external to the organization, or seeking certification or registration of that management system by an external organization. All the requirements in the standard are intended to be incorporated into any type of organization's management system that is based on the PCDA model. Where the standards are being considered to apply, an organization can actually be challenged by persons external to the organization, whether they're customers or other organizations who would necessarily have interest in that security. So it may be even more important for organizations that actually provide those types of, or who are part of the supply chain, to consider implementing those policies, primarily because of the potential of having to answer to external parties. The international standard provides the elements, including those addressing technology, facilities, processes, and people required for this incorporation. The extent of the application of this international standard will depend on factors such as the risk tolerance and the policy of the organizations, the nature and scale of its activities, products and services, and the location and the conditions in which the organization functions. The standard also provides generic requirements as a framework applicable to all types of organizations or parts thereof, regardless of size and function in the supply chain. So it allows the necessary organization to tailor it for their specific needs. It provides guidance to develop their own specific performance criteria, enabling the organization to tailor and implement a resilience management policy appropriate to its needs and those of its stakeholders. So implementing such a policy does not necessarily have to be overbearing in having requirements that do not necessarily apply to our specific environments. The international standard emphasizes resilience and adaptive capacity of an organization in a complex and changing environment, as we see COVID really changed environments across the world, as well as protection of critical supply chain assets and processes. Applying this international standard positions an organization to more readily prevent, if possible, prepare for and respond to all manner of intentional, unintentional, and unnaturally caused disruptive events, which if unmanaged could escalate into an emergency crisis or disaster. It covers all phases of incident management before, during, and after a disruptive event. The standard provides a framework for an organization to develop prevention, protection, preparedness, mitigation, and response, continuity, recovery policy, establish objectives, procedures, and processes to achieve the policy commitments, to assure competency, awareness, and training, and to set metrics to measure performance and demonstrate success. Also to take action as needed to improve performance, to demonstrate conformity of the system to the requirements of the standard, to establish and apply a process for continual improvement. And once again, the mention of the continual improvement is not a set and forget, but a set, continue, review, improve, and so on. And the annexes, Annex A provides informative guidance on the system planning, implementation, testing, maintenance, security management systems for the supply chain, requirements for bodies providing audit and certification of supply chain management systems. So those would not be the organizations doing the implementation. Those would be the ones ensuring that the requirements are met. So we have the once again, the standard is broken down into its standard sections: introduction, scope, normative references, terms and definitions, principles for certification bodies, the general requirements, structural requirements, resource requirements, information requirements, and process requirements. Then it looks at the management system requirements for certification bodies, what they would need so that they can do the necessary certification. And the annexes, Annex A, guide for process to determine auditor time. Annex B, criteria for auditing organizations with multiple sites. Annex C, auditor education, work and audit experience and training durations. Annex D, auditor competence requirements and process requirements. Sorry, auditor competence requirements and and process requirements. Hang on, is there process requirements? Because I'm seeing that on my screen. I don't know if it's left over from the previous page. Okay. All right, next slide, please. The international standard contains principles and requirements for bodies providing the audit and certification of the supply chain security management systems according to the management system specifications and standards such as ISO 28000. It defines the minimum requirements of a certification body and its associated auditors, recognizing the unique need for confidentiality when auditing and certifying or registering a client organization. So it defines what would need to be done, or what the needs are of that certification or audit body. It defines the minimum requirements of a certification body and its associated auditors, recognizing the unique need for confidentiality. When auditing, also define an organization, a client organization. The requirements for supply chain security management systems can originate from a number of sources, and the standard has been developed to assist in the certification of supply chain security management systems that fulfill the requirements of ISO 28000 and other supply chain security management systems international standards. The contents may also be used to support certification of supply chain security management systems that are based on other specified supply chain security management system requirements. The standard provides harmonized guidance for the accreditation of certification bodies applying for ISO 28000 or other specified supply chain security management requirements, certification/registration about the way, harmonized guidance about the way certification of their suppliers have been granted. Next slide, please. It defines the rules applicable for the audit and certification of a supply chain security management system, complying with the supply chain security management system standards requirements or other specified supply chain security management system requirements that will ensure some level of conformity across different organizations and even different regions, so that those requirements would be more or less consistent across those different areas. Provides the customers with the necessary information and confidence about the way certification of their suppliers has been granted.